Operation Castor, this is the operation to jump into Dien Bien Phu, okay? And to set up an aero-terrestrial base. What the idea is that they're going to set up a base in the valley of Dien Bien Phu for a number of reasons, and I'll try and go through those to work out what the French were trying to achieve. Why were they doing this? The French were having a problem in Laos with the Viet Minh moving into Laos. So what they wanted to do was try and interdict the line of communication which ran through the valley of Dien Bien Phu to cut off the Viet Minh troops which would go into Laos, which was becoming a problem. Now, the French had done this before. They'd fought a battle in 52 at a place called Nha San, where they dropped 5 battalions behind the Vietnamese lines, set up a hedgehog defensive position to draw the Viet Cong onto them. And that operation was quite successful. Right? Giap took the bait and attacked it, and the losses for the Viet Minh were quite severe. It's one of the least successful of Giap's battles. So Nha San was successful. One of the reasons it was successful is that the base, once they dropped in, was set up on top of a series of hills, which was not going to be the case in Dien Bien Phu. So that's one of the reasons. The setting up of a base, why do we want to do this? We want to protect Laos. The other thing was that Navari wanted to bring the Viet Minh to battle. That's what he wants to do. He wants to draw them onto him so he can destroy them in a fixed battle. A number of conclusions were done about the valley of Dien Bien Phu. The valley itself is about 10 miles long and about 6 miles wide, surrounded by wooded hills with small knolls in the bottom of the valley. The river Nam Yam runs through the bottom of it, and Route RC41 runs through it as well. So it's significantly important from a logistic base. There's also an airfield there. The French had occupied the valley before, although they weren't occupying at the time, and they built an airstrip there before. So there was already a semblance of an airstrip there, right? It was on Route 41, which was an important transit route for the Viet Minh, and it's got water supply. It's in the middle of a valley. The French made a number of assumptions, one of which that the Viet Minh would not be able to bring their artillery to bear, right, effectively. They worked on the principle that even if the Viet Minh rather, could bring their artillery into position, it'd be lightweight cannon, like 75 millimeters. They had no idea they were going to bring 105s. And the general assumption was that all their artillery would have to be positioned on the reverse slopes, which would reduce their range and effectiveness. What Giap did ultimately when he got his artillery into position was they dug them in on the forward slopes, which increased their range. And the Viet Minh always had a great advantage, right, of being able to look down on Dien Bien Phu from the high ground, which gave them good ability to adjust whatever artillery fire they were going to do. Operation Castor then, it's going to be launched on the 20th of November 1953. Most of the troops weren't briefed till the 17th of November. Okay, they'd been got together. They knew something was going to happen. They didn't know what the plan was, right? And for security reasons, they weren't briefed until about the 17th of November, right? The initial drop was into the center of the valley. Please try and ignore the defensive positions which are on that map. It's just showing where the DZs are, really. These defensive positions haven't been set up yet. On 3 DZs, 2 battalions going to jump in the morning because we only got enough aircraft to drop 2 battalions at a time, and 1 in the afternoon, followed over the next period of days by another 2 parachute battalions. So eventually there'll be 5 parachute battalions, right, plus engineers and all the rest of the support in the valley of Dien Bien Phu. There were Viet Minh in the valley. 148th Viet Minh Regiment was training in the valley at the time when the drop went in. Okay, and there was fighting on the DZ, and the French, whilst they had consolidated very quickly, lost about 30 blokes, all right, while they consolidated, clearing the Viet Minh out of the valley. But apart from that, it was an entirely successful operation. Now, they settled down in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, building their defensive positions. There was not a massive amount of fighting really until the end of January. All right, the French probed outwards, all right, the Viet Minh probed inwards, but what was generally going on is they're digging their defensive positions, they're preparing their defensive positions in the valley. Giap with the Viet Minh is busy building up his forces, his logistics, getting his artillery in, getting everything else into position, all right? And really between November and the end of January, whilst there was fighting by battalion, even battalion level patrols going out into the forest and into the trees, there was not a massive amount of fighting there. Right? Now that period of time was not well spent by the French in reinforcing and building their defensive positions. That should have been their primary function. But then again, you go back to the question of what are we here for? Right? And that was one of the big debates about Dien Bien Phu. What was the aim of the operation? Was it to stop the Vietnamese going into Laos? Was it to make a base from which they could go out and attack the Viet Minh, right? Or was it a base to draw the Viet Minh in, right? So they could write them off in a fixed battle. Giap spent the last 2-3 months building up his forces, right? His first artillery rounds are fired into the valley, all right, at the end of January, right? Excluding mortars and some 75mm rounds, which weren't fired into the valley. Giap's plan. Giap had a plan in January, right? Giap's original plan was, excuse me, was at the end of January, he was going to form all his divisions in a circle around it and do one huge attack on Dien Bien Phu. Literally, they were going to fire everything they had into Dien Bien Phu, and they were going to attack it from 4 different directions with 4 divisions in a general go for broke, overrun the entire place. Now, he was convinced by somebody, and we're not sure who, it might have been a Chinese advisors, because there were Chinese advisors, that probably wasn't the best option, and it might not succeed. Okay, so he then set about using his artillery to disrupt the base for as long as possible, and they carried on all through February, right, bringing artillery to fire, artillery fire to bear on all the positions around the valley and on the airstrip, which made it increasingly difficult to succeed. Now, the first serious attack on the base was against Beatrice. Beatrice is a top right-hand horse. It's got number 1 marked on this map. All right. It was plastered with artillery on the 13th of March, all day. All right. And then eventually, about 6:15 at night, like 2 regiments, right, of one of the Viet Minh divisions literally stormed the position. They took it in about 6 hours. Right? Foreign Legion Battalion was holding the position. Right? The headquarters, right, thought that they could hold attacks. All right? They were amazed and astonished, frankly, that the Viet Minh had succeeded in capturing one of their strong points in 6 hours. Of the almost 1,000 people, between it depends what you read, 750 and 1,000 people defending Beatrice, only about 100 of them got out. The rest were either captured or killed before the position, or after the position had been overrun. By dawn on the 14th, all right, Beatrice had fallen. This was a complete all right, to the French, who felt that they could safely hold all these positions. As an aside, interesting, one of the officers, and you'll love this, the commander of the 10th Company, all right, of the Foreign Legion Battalion, because it was the 3rd Battalion that was holding Beatrice, was a bloke called Captain Nicholas, right? On the morning of the 13th of March, he got a letter, because the post was still coming in, all right? which was his tax form, right? And he received a letter saying, if you don't complete and return your tax form by the end of the month, we're going to stop your wages, right? Thank you to the French government for that. Captain Nicholas didn't survive the attack on the night of the 13th. So undoubtedly his tax return was never put in. But bureaucracy is a wonderful thing, and the French are really good at it. So Beatrice is lost on the 13th. Next one is Gabrielle. Now, Gabrielle's held by a battalion of Algerians. They'd seen Beatrice fall by the morning of the 14th. Okay, and almost immediately they start getting plastered with artillery. Okay, during the 15th, right, the Viet Minh attack them. Again, 2 regiments, right? The place holds out for 28 hours. Okay, they put up a marvelous resistance, but eventually, all right, by the end of the 15th, they've almost lost control of almost everywhere. A counterattack is attempted from the area of the airstrip to reinforce them, but that's unsuccessful. It's cut to pieces trying to get over the open ground. Something like 400 guys were killed or wounded trying to counterattack to relieve Gabrielle. Gabrielle fell, right? About 50 people from the Algerians got out of Gabrielle, and that was it. So in 2 days, effectively 3 days, right, Giap has now succeeded, right, in taking out the 2 most northerly outposts of Dien Bien Phu. Now, this has sent shockwaves through the headquarters of Dien Bien Phu, back to Cogni in Hanoi. Navarrese beginning to panic down in Saigon. Right, they're all putting up umbrellas saying, "Oh, it wasn't my idea, it wasn't my fault." It's astonishingly what's going on. The next place to fall was Anne Marie. All right, by the 17th, the Thai garrison, there's a Thai militia battalion commanding Anne Marie. They've seen that they very quickly saw that because they're local population, they live locally, their families live locally. The Thai hills to the north, that the writing's on the wall here, and they basically implode. Okay, and they either they frankly pack up and leave. Okay, they try and disappear into the woods. They try and disappear, and Anne Marie is lost, not through an assault by the Viet Minh, but because the Thai battalion, which is holding it, their morale collapses because they can see the writing on the wall. They're local people. They know what's going to happen, and they basically pack up and go. So 3 strong points have now been lost within 4 days. Right, 3 strong points: Anne Marie, Beatrice, and Gabrielle have been lost. The French are in a bit shell-shocked by this. Now, the frontal wave attacks that the Viet Minh have been putting in on the French in these sectors have been expensive. The Viet Minh rather, have lost between 4,000 and 5,000 men, right, killed or wounded, clearing the 2 northern strongpoints and taking over Anne Marie, which had been occupied by some French troops. So enormous losses, these wave tactics that they unsophisticated attacks. Giap then decides we need a pause, we need a rethink. And what he does from then on, he starts, right, sapping. He starts siege warfare. They start sapping in, they start digging trenches in, they start digging mines under French positions. This is all going back to World War I, almost the Somme type tactics. And creeping forward and eliminating strong points in a slow and methodical way. And they carry on doing this really until the middle of April. By the end of April, jumping forward slightly, okay, by the end of April, Isabel is isolated to the south. There's nothing much they can do. Anne Marie's lost. Phu Jet eventually is lost. They're worn down. Dominique and Eliane, who are on the other side of the river, the two first ones that fall. The French try desperately to cling on to holding on to them, but they can't. and they lose those. The entire place is being constricted all the time. The Viet Minh largely ignore Isabel in the south, thinking, well, we're not worried about that because it's not part of the main defensive position anyway. We'll worry about them later. Francois, which is a small position on the outskirts, is abandoned, all right, as they pull back into the center. By the third week in April, the air usable. So every single thing that comes into the base now has got to come in by parachute, resupply. The Americans give the French 30,000 parachutes during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, right, for air dropping support, which is quite astonishing. Airdrops carry on. Paratroops are dropped in, right? Another 4 battalions, equivalent of 4 battalions, are dropped into the center of Dien Bien Phu. You can argue reinforcement of failure is not a good basic principle, but they want to hold on to this. And I'll talk about this when we come to talk about the Geneva conferences, because that's equally important. The raison d'etre for this is equally important there. But these people really, they're fighting for survival here down at the bottom of the valley. The French got to the stage, they dropped 600, or attempted to drop 680 guys into the valley who'd never parachuted before, okay, as reinforcements. These guys' first jump, right, from an aircraft was into Dien Bien Phu. Some of them refused to jump because they'd never jumped out of an airplane before, but somewhere in the region of 600 of them actually jumped into the valley. Astonishingly, very few of them were injured, even though they were largely untrained parachutists. But, well, this time, Gap 2 is basically running below. Lang Lace and the airborne mafia. De Castries is stuck away in his bunker, and he's sort of getting on with running his affairs, whereas Lang Lace, Bigard, and the rest of the airborne guys are busy fighting. And Leland, who's fighting his own personal battle down in Isabelle, he's another Foreign Legion officer down in Isabelle. Eventually, on the 7th of May, the inevitable happens, and the entire place is overrun. The flag, your bottom right-hand corner, the flag there is raised over de Castries' headquarters. All these pictures, okay, were staged after the battle. The Viet Minh propaganda pictures staged after the battle, but they're all taken actually in Dien Bien Phu. So whilst they're not actually combat photographs, they are taken in Dien Bien Phu afterwards. The middle left one particularly is quite obviously, you know, a staged photograph just to show what the Viet Minh have achieved. And the center falls on the 7th. Isabel in the south, right? There is thoughts of breaking out from Isabel in the south, trying to get into Laos, about 100 kilometers away. Eventually they abandon that. And Isabel is overrun on the morning of the 8th. Okay, so effectively the battle's over on the 7th. Isabel surrenders on the 8th. De Castries is captured in his bunker, which is the one with a flag on the bottom right-hand side there, right, on the 7th. So that the entire place is overrun on the 7th. Interesting, the last drop of reinforcements into Dien Bien Phu is on the 6th. They're still dropping people into Dien Bien Phu, individual replacements on the 6th of May, and it's overrun effectively on the 7th. And the background to all of this, right, is the Geneva conferences, which theoretically started in July 1954. Now, the Geneva conferences had 2 roles. One was about Indochina, and the other one was about Korea, because, of course, what we haven't mentioned, of course, is Korea from 1950 to 53. So the Geneva conferences were, well, what are we going to do about Indochina and Korea? Korea was obviously divided along the 38th parallel, as it had been prior to the Korean War. And the knock-on effect for Vietnam was right, that they divided Vietnam in half along the 17th parallel, what would become known during the Vietnam War as the demilitarized zone along the 17th parallel. With the communists controlling the north, right, Laos became independent, Cambodia became independent, and Vietnam in the south became an independent nation. This suited nobody in particular. The Vietnamese didn't like it, north or south. The Americans didn't like it. The French didn't like it, but they'd lost the war anyway, so the influence of it was pretty null and void. And that was the end result, okay? Dien Bien Phu was lost. That effectively sealed the end of the Indochina War. And Vietnam, through the Geneva conferences, was divided in half. The Geneva conferences were still forming up when the fighting was still going on in Dien Bien Phu. Yeah, it's a satirical cartoon. The fall of Dien Bien Phu, the people in Dien Bien getting newspapers telling them what's going on in Geneva, where they're talking about the fact that they've already lost the war. Okay. It was important for both sides. The French wanted to hold on at Dien Bien Phu to put themselves in a good position at the Geneva conference. The Vietnamese wanted to win at Dien Bien Phu to again put themselves in a decent position at the Geneva conference to get what they wanted from that conference. So both for both sides, Dien Bien Phu was an important point for both sides of the argument. They both wanted, one wanted to take it, the other one wanted to hold it, to reinforce their position at the Geneva conferences, but in effect, it didn't help. It fell before the conferences made any decent decisions on what was going on.